The cold bit through the thick leather of his flight jacket. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, at 20 years old already with 43 confirmed kills painted in neat black crosses beneath his cockpit, scanned the deep blue emptiness above the Cuban River. It was March 17, 1943. The air smelled of damp earth, oil, and the faint, ever-present tang of cordite. Below, the patchwork of thawing fields and scarred earth that was the Eastern Front stretched to a smudged horizon. His Messerschmitt Bf 109G-6, Karaya 1, felt like an extension of his own body, its Daimler-Benz engine purring with a familiar, confident rhythm. Through his headset crackled the voice of his wingman, Feldwebel Walter Krupinski. "Anything on your side, Bubai?" Krupinski asked, using the squadron's nickname for the baby-faced ace. "Nothing but sky and a few unhappy Ivans down there," Hartmann replied, his eyes never stopping their practiced sweeping motion. "Quiet day. Too quiet. I heard the armies are sending more of their planes to the Russians. Lend-lease. Maybe we'll get to meet some." Hartmann allowed himself a small, confident smirk. American planes. He'd seen the intelligence photos, the Airacobra with its ridiculous engine behind the pilot, the big, twin-boomed Lightning. They looked ungainly, overcomplicated. He'd heard stories from veterans transferred from the Channel Front, tales of American pilots flying in tight, inflexible formations, of them breaking off and diving away at the first sign of a real fight. They were businessmen, not warriors. Factory workers playing at being soldiers. The very idea that they could stand against the battle-hardened veterans of JG-52, men who had dueled with the best of the Soviet Air Force and won, was almost amusing. "If they come, we'll add them to the tally," Hartmann said, his voice calm. "From what I hear, they fly like they have a price tag on their tails, too expensive to risk." Krupinski laughed. "Maybe we'll get a bonus from the Reichsmarschall for shooting down capitalist aircraft." Hartmann's gaze caught a flicker of movement, a distant speck against the sun. His body tensed, then relaxed. A high-flying reconnaissance plane, likely a Russian Pemenis II, heading away. Not worth the fuel. He settled back into his seat, the familiar weight of his controls stick a comfort in his gloved hand. He was the master of this domain. The Bf 109 was the finest fighter in the sky, agile, responsive, and piloted by men forged in the furnace of total war. What could some rich, untested nation from across an ocean possibly send that could change that fundamental truth? He had no way of knowing that at that very moment, in a secure hangar at Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant on Long Island, a very different aircraft was being prepared for its journey to a war Erich Hartmann could not yet imagine, and the assumptions he held, shared by every pilot and commander in the Luftwaffe High Command, were not just wrong. They were a catastrophic blind spot that would soon be filled with the thunder of a Pratt & Whitney engine and the devastating hail of .850 caliber machine guns. The confidence that bordered on arrogance within the German fighter arm by early 1943 was not born of mere propaganda. It was forged in the hard statistics of aerial combat. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies. Over Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia, the combination of the Bf 109 and pilot skill had proven devastatingly effective. The kill ratios spoke for themselves. Seasoned German aces routinely racked up scores in the dozens, even hundreds against Soviet and, initially, British opponents. The Bf 109, particularly the new G-model Hartmann flew, was a known quantity. A lightweight, nimble interceptor that excelled in the vertical plane and could outturn almost anything at medium altitudes. German intelligence assessments of American aircraft, based on pre-war designs and early war observations, reinforced this sense of superiority. Reports filed by the Technisches Amt, Technical Office, of the Luftwaffe described the American P-47 Thunderbolt, first encountered in limited numbers over Europe in late 1942, in dismissive terms. It was Der Jug, the Juggernaut, a nickname meant to convey brute, clumsy strength, not finesse. The reports noted its immense size, nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109, and concluded it must be slow, unmaneuverable, and an easy target for the faster, more agile German fighters. These assessments were circulated, studied, and accepted as gospel. This confidence was underpinned by a deeper, cultural prejudice. Many in the German military hierarchy, shaped by a martial tradition that prized individual heroism and tactical brilliance, viewed the Americans as a nation of shopkeepers and mechanics. They produced quantity, the thinking went, but not quality. Their soldiers were soft, their pilots lacked the killer instinct honed by years of combat. A captured German intelligence memorandum from early 1943, circulated among fighter group commanders, stated bluntly, "The American pilot relies on his machinery and numerical advantage. He lacks the improvisational skill and aggressive spirit of the German flyer. When his technological crutches are kicked away, he becomes confused and vulnerable." This wasn't just official dogma. It was a belief felt in the gut by men like Hartmann. They had seen it themselves, or so they believed. Early encounters with American formations over France seemed to confirm it. Tight, defensive boxes of bombers, fighters that seemed reluctant to mix it up in a turning dogfight. But there were whispers, fragments of information that didn't fit the neat narrative. A veteran pilot transferred from the Mediterranean mentioned the new American P-38 Lightnings were tricky and fast in a dive. A report from a forward observer in Tunisia, hastily scribbled and stained with mud, noted that a flight of American fighters had engaged Focke-Wulf FW-190s at an altitude the observer swore was over 30,000 feet, a realm where German engines typically gasped for air. These reports were filed away, marked unconfirmed or exaggerated by ground personnel. They were anomalies, glitches in the otherwise clear picture of German aerial supremacy. The system, so confident in its own understanding, had no mechanism to process data that contradicted its core beliefs. The few voices of caution, like that of the brilliant but often ignored General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, who warned that the Americans were learning fast and their industrial output was a strategic threat, were drowned out by the roar of continued, if increasingly costly, successes on the Eastern Front, and the belief that technological marvels like the Me-262 jet fighter would soon render all piston-engine debates obsolete. What the German intelligence apparatus failed to comprehend, what they could barely conceptualize, was the nature of the American industrial beast they had awakened. They were looking at a snapshot from 1942, while the reality was accelerating into 1943 and beyond at a pace that defied European experience. While German aircraft production was sophisticated, dispersed to avoid bombing, and often hampered by material shortages and bureaucratic infighting, American production was something else entirely. A tidal wave of organized, optimized fury. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is the story of that industrial might personified. Its chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, was a Georgian-born aeronautical engineer whose philosophy was brutally practical. Build a fighter that could survive, kill, and come home. He didn't set out to create a ballet dancer of the skies. He built a flying tank. The heart of the Thunderbolt was the Pratt & Whitney RMS 2000 800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial monster that produced over 2,000 horsepower. But its true secret, the innovation that would shatter German assumptions about high-altitude performance, was the General Electric turbo supercharger. This complex system, mounted in the rear fuselage, used exhaust gases to spin a turbine that forced compressed air into the engine, allowing it to breathe normally at altitudes where the thin air would starve a conventional engine. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a labyrinth of ducts and intercoolers that American production lines learned to mass-produce with stunning efficiency. The numbers are what truly boggle the mind, then and now. While Messerschmitt's main Regensburg plant, even before the devastating Allied bombings, struggled to produce 120-150 Bf-109s per month. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory was hitting a pace of 15 Thunderbolts per day. By the end of the war, Republic would build 15,683 P-47s. To put that in perspective, Germany produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109s of all variants throughout the entire war. America was on track to produce more than one specific type of heavy fighter than Germany produced of its most famous fighter overall. And the P-47 was just one part of the arsenal. North American aviation was churning out P-51 Mustangs. Lockheed was building P-38 Lightnings. The production wasn't just about airframes, it was about everything inside them. Each P-47 carried 8 Browning M1250 caliber machine guns, with 425 rounds per gun. That's 34 rounds of ammunition per aircraft. American factories produced 50 caliber ammunition by the billion round. The scale was incomprehensible to a German war economy already straining under blockade and resource constraints. The culture of innovation was just as alien. American engineering was pragmatic and iterative. Problems were solved with relentless testing and redesign. Early Thunderbolts had issues with cockpit visibility and landing gear strength. Engineers fixed them. Test pilots like Colonel Mike Hunter pushed the aircraft to its limits, discovering its incredible dive speed. It could easily exceed 500 mph in a dive, a realm where the wings of a Bf-109 risked tearing off. They learned to fight with its strengths. Never turn with a lighter fighter if you could help it. Use the massive engine and robust construction to climb to superior altitude. Then use the weight as an advantage in a thunderous, unstoppable dive. A boom and zoom attack that played to the Thunderbolt's unique capabilities. This tactical doctrine was being written in training manuals and taught to a new generation of pilots, many of whom were, contrary to German belief, not soft or unskilled, but were receiving more flight training hours before combat than their German counterparts had in years. The first, faint tremors of the coming earthquake began to register on German instruments in the spring and summer of 1943, but they were misinterpreted as static. Over Western Europe, where the USAAF's 8th Air Force was beginning its daylight bombing campaign in earnest, encounters with the new American escorts became more frequent. Initial after-action reports from German pilots contained confused, contradictory details. A pilot of JG-26 Schlageter reported engaging a large, radial-engine fighter near Antwerp in April 1943. He described making a textbook attack from above, only to have the American aircraft, instead of trying to turn and fight, simply nosed over and dove away with shocking acceleration. "I attempted to follow," the pilot wrote, "but my aircraft began to buffet violently at over 750 kilometers per hour. He simply disappeared." The report was filed with a note from the Gruppenkommandeur. Pilot likely overestimated speed due to combat stress. Enemy aircraft incapable of such performance. Another report, more alarming, came from a staffel of JG-2 Richthofen in May. They intercepted a formation of B-17s near the German border. As they prepared to attack, a squadron of escorting fighters dove on them from an altitude the German leader estimated at well over 9,000 meters. The engagement was brief and costly. 2 Bf-109s were shot down. The German pilots reported the escorts were Thunderbolts, but they were much faster than expected, especially in the climb after their attack. This report made it higher up the chain. An intelligence officer at Luftwaffe headquarters compared it to the known specs of the P-47. The math didn't add up. The Thunderbolt's published top speed was around 690 km/h at altitude. The German pilots were describing behavior consistent with a plane 80-100 km/h faster. The officer's conclusion, stamped on the file, Was discrepancy likely due to misidentification? Aircraft were probably the new P-38 Lightning or possibly Spitfire Mk.IX. Thunderbolt performance as documented remains accurate. This was the critical failure, the refusal to update the documented performance. The intelligence was static, trapped in reports from a year prior. Meanwhile, in Farmingdale and Evansville, Indiana, where a second P-47 plant opened, engineers were constantly tweaking and improving. New paddle blade propellers improved climb rate. Engine refinements squeezed out more horsepower. The P-47D model, rolling off the lines by the thousands in mid-1943, was a significantly better aircraft than the P-47C that the German manuals described. But the German intelligence picture remained frozen. It was a dangerous case of institutional arrogance. To accept that the Americans had fielded a fighter that could outperform the Bf-109 at high altitude was to accept a fundamental blow to the Luftwaffe's identity. It was easier, psychologically and bureaucratically, to blame the pilots. They were getting tired, they were making mistakes, they were facing overwhelming numbers which flustered them into overestimating enemy capability. Even when physical evidence arrived, it was viewed through the lens of preconception. In late July 1943, a damaged P-47D of the 4th Fighter Group made a forced landing in a Belgian field. German technicians swarmed over it. They were impressed by its rugged construction, its roomy cockpit, and the sheer size of its engine. But their report to Berlin focused on its perceived flaws. Its weight, its wide turning radius, the complexity of its turbo-supercharger system which they deemed over-engineered and vulnerable to battle damage. The report concluded, while a formidable aircraft in specific circumstances, the P-47 is not a dogfighter. Our pilots, by exploiting its poor maneuverability and using superior tactics, can defeat it. The captured aircraft was shipped to the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium, Reich Air Ministry, for further study, but the essential conclusion had been drawn. The Thunderbolt was a brute, not a fencer. German fighter pilots continued to be briefed that the Jug was a slow, clumsy target. The stage was set for a catastrophic collision between perception and reality. That collision began in earnest on a clear, cold morning in early October 1943. The target for the 8th Air Force was the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, a deep penetration mission that would test the limits of fighter escort. Oberleutnant Hartmann, by now a veteran of the brutal Kursk offensive and with 148 kills to his name, was far away on the Eastern Front. But over Western Europe, men who shared his confidence and training were about to have it shattered. Hauptmann Franz Evers, a 26-year-old Staffelkapitän of JG-3 Unit, lifted his Focke-Wulf FW-190 Ammonus 6 off the rain-dampened runway at Oldenburg. He led a swarm of 4 aircraft, part of a larger group scrambled to intercept the incoming American bomber stream. The FW-190 was a different beast than the Bf-109, heavier, more heavily armed, with a radial engine of its own. Evers loved it. It was a stable gun platform, incredibly tough, and in a low-altitude turning fight it could outmaneuver anything the Allies had. As he climbed through a thin layer of stratus cloud into the brilliant autumn sun, he felt the usual calm focus settle over him. The controller's voice in his headset was crisp. Indianer from the west, estimated strength 200 plus, altitude 7,000 meters, course 110. Escorts reported. Understood, Evers replied. He checked his instruments, fuel good, cannons armed. His 3 wingmen were tight in formation. Escorts, probably those Thunderbolts. He'd heard the newer pilots talk about them with a hint of nervousness, but the old hands, like his commandeur, just laughed. Big, slow targets, the commandeur had said at briefing just yesterday. They have to stay close to their bombers. Get in, hit hard, get out before they can react. They can't turn with you. Remember that. At 22,000 feet, Evers saw them. a dark, sprawling stain on the horizon, slowly resolving into individual specks. The Wehrmachts, the four-engine bombers. Hundreds of them flying in their formidable combat boxes, contrails sketching white lines across the blue. He scanned for the escorts. There they were, smaller dots, weaving above and around the bomber stream. He counted. A dozen, maybe 20. Manageable. His Grupp had 30-plus FW-190s climbing to meet them. The odds were acceptable, even good. All units, this is Zerberus leader. The voice of the Gruppenkommandeur crackled over the radio. We will attack the escorts first. Break them up, then go for the bombers. Remember, the jabs are heavy. Use your speed and roll rate. Evers led his swarm higher, aiming to gain an altitude advantage over the escorting fighters. As they drew closer, the specks became shapes. He squinted. They were big. Their profiles were unmistakable. The deep, rounded nose of the radial engine, the distinctive elliptical wings. Thunderbolts, just as briefed. He saw they were flying in loose, staggered pairs, not the tight, defensive formations he associated with earlier American fighters. A different tactic. He pushed the thought aside. A Chtung, Indianer at 12 o'clock high, same altitude, he warned his men. We take the pair on the left. Follow me in. He rolled his FW-190 onto its back and pulled the stick back into his stomach, executing a slicing split test that converted his altitude into speed. The world spun, then righted itself as he dove, his three wingmen following like shadows. He picked a target, a P-47 flying slightly apart from its wingman. The range closed with terrifying speed. 800 meters. 600. He centered the pipper of his Rivi gun sight on the broad, silver fuselage. He could see the details now. The black and white invasion stripes still on the wings, the individual panels on the cowling. The Thunderbolt hadn't seen him yet. Perfect. At 400 meters, he thumbed the trigger. His FW-190 shuddered as its two 20 MG-151 cannons in the wing roots and two 13 machine guns in the nose sent a converging stream of shells and bullets toward the American fighter. Tracers lanced out. This was it. The kill was seconds away. And then the Thunderbolt did something no big, slow target should have been able to do. It didn't try to turn, it didn't brake. It simply dropped. The pilot shoved his nose forward with violent urgency. 1 second it was there, filling Evers' gun sight. The next, it was a shrinking shape hurtling toward the earth. Evers, committed to his dive, followed instinctively. His FW-190 picked up speed, the wind screaming in his ears. The altimeter unwound, 20,000 feet, 18,000, 16,000. He was gaining, but not as fast as he should have been. The Thunderbolt was a dark blur ahead, accelerating with what seemed like supernatural force. At 15,000 feet, Evers' aircraft began to vibrate, a low-frequency buffeting that shook the control stick. He was approaching his redline speed. The Thunderbolt showed no such distress. It continued to pull away, vanishing into the haze below like a stone dropped into a pond. What the hell was that? His wingman, Unteroffizier Becker, radioed, his voice tight with surprise. He dove, Evers replied, pulling back on the stick to level out, his body pressed into the seat by the G-forces. He just dove. Before he could process it further, a warning shout erupted in his headset. Zerberus leader, break left, more above. Evers craned his neck, looking up and behind. His blood went cold. While he had been focused on his diving attack, the sky above had filled with new contacts. Not a dozen, not 20, dozens. Perhaps 50 or more silver shapes circling at an even higher altitude. They weren't the tight escort he'd seen initially. This was a second wave, a high-cover squadron that had been lurking in the sun, waiting, and they were now diving. All units disengage, climb. Climb to the east, the Gruppencommandeur's voice ordered, but it was too late. The sky erupted into a chaotic, screaming tableau. The diving Thunderbolts didn't come down in a gentle slope. They fell like avenging angels, their engines howling at full military power. Evers saw one latch onto the tail of a FW-190 from another swarm. The German pilot broke hard right, then left, performing the sharp, jerking maneuvers that had always shaken Allied pursuers. The Thunderbolt stayed with him, not trying to match the turn, but using its superior speed in the vertical to cut the corner, to maintain a position where its guns could bear. Then Evers saw the flashes, not the brief twinkles of cannon fire, but a sustained, rippling torrent of fire from the Thunderbolt's wing roots. 8 streams of 50 caliber tracers converged on the FW-190. The effect was horrifying. Pieces flew off the German fighter, a chunk of wing, then the tailplane. It rolled onto its back, trailing a thick plume of black smoke, and spun earthward. "They're too fast," someone screamed on the radio. "I can't shake him." Evers shoved his throttle to the firewall and pulled back hard, seeking the sanctuary of altitude. His BMW engine roared, climbing past 25,000 RPM. He watched his altimeter creep upward. 17,000, 18,000, 19,000 feet. He risked a glance behind. A Thunderbolt was there, maybe 800 meters back, climbing after him. But it wasn't just climbing. It was gaining. Evers' mind reeled. The FW-190 was a good climber, especially at medium altitudes. This was impossible, yet the evidence was there in his mirror, growing larger. The Thunderbolt's nose was high, its big propeller biting the thin air, but it was coming on steadily, implacably. The intelligence reports, the briefing, the confident laughter, all of it crumbled in the face of this simple, terrifying fact. The American fighter was outclimbing him. At 22,000 feet, the gap had closed to 500 meters. Evers could see the individual exhaust stacks on the P-47's cowling. He was trapped. He couldn't outdive it. He couldn't outclimb it. Turning was his only hope. He slammed his stick to the left and kicked full left rudder, throwing his FW-190 into a maximum performance turn. The G-forces crushed him, blurring his vision. He held the turn, waiting for the telltale sign that the heavier fighter had overshot. It never came. When he dared to look back, the Thunderbolt was still there, hanging on the edge of his turn. It wasn't turning with him. It was using its power to carve a wider, faster circle, maintaining its angular advantage. The pilot was smart. He wasn't trying to dogfight. He was using the Thunderbolt's energy to keep the kill shot. Evers reversed his turn, rolling right. The P-47 pilot anticipated it, rolling with him. A cold sweat broke out on Evers' forehead. This was not a novice. This was a hunter. A new sound entered his consciousness. A low, ripping telegraph pole sound, getting louder. Tracers. Not the slow, glowing orbs of 20 cannon shells, but the faster, redder lines of machine gun fire. They streamed past his canopy, first to the right, then walking closer. The Thunderbolt had opened fire from nearly 600 meters, a range at which German pilots would have held their fire. But the American wasn't firing a few cannon shells. He was hosing the sky with a hydrant-like stream of bullets. The volume of fire was staggering. Evers jinked desperately, but the cone of fire was so wide, so dense, that avoiding all of it was a matter of luck. A series of loud, metallic clangs reverberated through his airframe, like a giant striking the fuselage with a sledgehammer. His control stick jerked in his hand. The FW-190 yawed violently to the right. Smoke, thin and acrid, began to seep into the cockpit from the instrument panel. A glance at his gauges showed his oil pressure dropping to 0. The engine note changed, becoming rough, labored. "I'm hit. Engine hit," he transmitted, his voice surprisingly calm. "Evers, bail out, get out." It was Becker, his wingman, but Becker sounded far away, his transmission broken by static and other, more frantic voices crowding the frequency. "Everywhere, they're coming from the sun. My wing is gone. I'm chase. There's another one on me." The radio was a bedlam of panic and confusion, the disciplined Luftwaffe fighter control dissolving into chaos. Evers' FW-190 was dying. The engine seized with a final, terrible shudder and the propeller froze. Silence except for the rush of wind. He had altitude, 18,000 feet. He had time. He released his harness, reached for the canopy release and pulled. The canopy refused to budge. Jammed. He pulled harder, panic rising in his throat. It was stuck fast, likely warped by the gunfire or the stress of the maneuvers. He was trapped in a gliding metal coffin. He looked out. The sky around him was a swirling madness of individual combats. He saw two more FW-190s spinning down, trailing fire. He saw thunderbolts everywhere, not just the silver ones now, but ones with colorful nose art, working in pairs, methodically picking off the scattered German fighters. It wasn't a battle, it was a rout. The high-cover thunderbolts had done their job perfectly. They had bounced the interceptors, broken their cohesion, and now the lower escorts were mopping up. The bombers, their target apparently forgotten for the moment, droned on serenely toward Schweinfurt, their defensive boxes intact. His aircraft was losing altitude rapidly, beginning to spin lazily. The ground, a distant mosaic of greens and browns, began to rotate in his windscreen. He hammered at the canopy with his fists, then drew his pistol, firing 2 rounds at the plexiglass. The bullets starred the material but didn't penetrate. Useless. Then he saw it. A thunderbolt, its pilot perhaps seeing his helpless state, broke off from another engagement and slid into formation off his right wing, so close Evers could see the pilot's face. A young man with an oxygen mask, his eyes visible behind goggles. The American pilot looked at him, looked at the frozen propeller and the smoke, and then did something extraordinary. He didn't fire. He simply rocked his wings once, a gesture that could have meant anything, acknowledgement, pity, a signal to bail out, and then pushed his stick forward, diving away to rejoin the fight. The gesture, that moment of chivalry in the midst of the slaughter, shocked Evers more than the attack itself. It spoke of a confidence so absolute that a kill could be spared. It was the final, devastating proof that everything was wrong. These were not nervous, inexperienced pilots flying inferior machines. They were confident, skilled, and they were flying fighters that were, in many critical ways, better than his own. His spinning descent became a spiral. The ground rushed up. Trees, a field, a church steeple. He pulled back on the stick with all his strength, trying to level the wings, to find some semblance of control for a crash landing. The last thing he saw, through the cracked and starred canopy, was the green blur of a forest rushing to meet him, and the contrails of the victorious American fighters, high above, turning for home. The Schweinfurt raid of October 1943 was a tactical disaster for the Americans, with 60 bombers lost. But for the German fighter arm, it was a profound and terrifying strategic warning. The P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived, not as a clumsy escort but as a dominant, high-altitude superiority fighter. The reports that had been dismissed as exaggerations were, in fact, understatements. In the weeks that followed, the kill ratios over Western Europe began to shift. The comfortable 3, 1 or 4, 1 advantages the Luftwaffe enjoyed began to evaporate, replaced by near parity and then, increasingly, losses that could not be sustained. The pilots were talking and the fear in their voices was new. They had a name for the sudden, devastating attacks from above. Der Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. But the true scale of the nightmare was still not understood. The German high command, reeling from the losses but still clinging to the idea of qualitative superiority, believed the Thunderbolt was an anomaly, a specialist high-altitude fighter that could be countered with new tactics and the imminent arrival of their own wonder weapons. They failed to grasp the most terrifying truth. The P-47 was not the end of American industrial innovation. It was merely the beginning. Even as German engineers worked frantically on the FW-190D and the Ta-152 to counter the Thunderbolt threat, an even more perfect Predator was already rolling off North American aviation's production lines in Inglewood, California. An aircraft with the range to fly to Berlin and back, the agility to dance with a Bf 109, and the sleek, deadly beauty of a shark. And this new aircraft was being produced not in the dozens, but in the hundreds, every single month. For Erich Hartmann, still racking up incredible scores on the Eastern Front, the war was about to change in a way he could not foresee. The quiet confidence of that March day over the Cuban would soon be replaced by a desperate struggle for survival against an enemy whose resources seemed limitless, whose technology evolved not in years, but in months, and whose pilots learned with a frightening, adaptive speed. The laughter had died over Western Europe. Soon, it would die everywhere, and the men who had once ruled the skies would find themselves looking up, always up, at the silver specks growing larger in the sun, hearing the rising howl of a Pratt and Whitney engine, and knowing with a certainty that froze the blood that the thunderclap was coming for them. The forest canopy, a green and brown blur, resolved into individual trees that rushed up with terrifying speed. France Evers pulled back on the stick with the last of his strength, muscles screaming against the G-forces of the spin. The FW-190's left wing clipped a towering pine with a sound like a giant axe strike. The world dissolved into a violent, cartwheeling kaleidoscope of splintering wood, tearing metal and soil. The impact drove the control column into his stomach, and his head snapped forward against the instrument panel. Then, darkness. He came to moments later to the smell of damp earth, gasoline, and the coppery tang of blood. Pain radiated from his ribs and left leg. The cockpit was a crumpled shell around him, the canopy miraculously shattered by the crash. He fumbled with his harness release, his fingers numb and clumsy. He fell out of the wreckage onto a bed of moss and pine needles. Above, through the shattered branches, he could see contrails crisscrossing the high blue, the distant drone of engines fading eastward. The battle was over. He was alive. His survival was a statistical anomaly in a morning of carnage. Of the 34 FW-190s of II/JG3 that had scrambled from Oldenburg, only 11 would return. 9 were shot down in the furious engagement with the 56th Fighter Group's Thunderbolts. A further 8, damaged and low on fuel, would crash land or be written off upon return. 4 pilots were dead, 3, including Evers, were wounded and captured, and 2 were missing. The Americans lost 2 P-47s. The kill ratio for that single engagement was not the 4-1 the Luftwaffe expected, but a catastrophic 0.221. The thunderclap had struck with full force. Evers was found by a farmer and his son, who handed him over to German Home Guard troops. His war was over. As he lay on a stretcher in a field hospital, his leg in a splint, he heard the whispers of the medical orderlies and the groans of other wounded pilots. The same phrases, uttered in tones of disbelief and fear, they came from nowhere. I couldn't outrun him. The bullets, they just kept coming. The myth of the clumsy jab was dead, shattered over the fields of Western Germany. The shockwaves from that October morning radiated outwards, not as a single event, but as a cascading series of defeats that revealed the scale of the German miscalculation. While Evers convalesced, the statistics began to paint a picture of systemic collapse. In the 6 weeks following the Schweinfurt raid, the Luftwaffe's fighter losses in defense of the Reich Command soared to an unsustainable 17% of frontline strength, where the average monthly loss rate had been around 120 aircraft in early 1943. It now spiked to over 340 in November alone. The kill ratio, once a comfortable 3.2-1 in favor of the Germans against the USAAF's early escorts, inverted. By December 1943, for every P-47 lost, the Luftwaffe was losing 1.8 of its own fighters. The qualitative edge had not just been blunted, it had been broken over the knee of American industrial and tactical might. This was not isolated to the cold skies over Germany. The same brutal lesson was being taught simultaneously across the globe, a synchronized curriculum in industrial warfare. While the Thunderbolts savaged the Luftwaffe over Europe, Their counterparts in the Pacific were executing a similar demolition of Japanese assumptions. At Rabaul, on November 2, 1943, a massive raid of over 100 P-38 Lightnings and U.S. Navy fighters decimated a Japanese force of a 6 million Zeros sent to intercept. The Japanese, like the Germans, clung to a doctrine of lightweight, highly maneuverable dogfighters piloted by spiritual warriors of unmatched skill. The American pilots, flying heavier, faster, better protected aircraft, refused to turn with them. They dove, climbed, and used their superior firepower, often 650 caliber machine guns or a combination of guns and cannon, to slash at the agile Zeros from distances where the Japanese 7.7 machine guns were useless. That day, the Japanese lost over 40 aircraft against 9 American. A captured diary from a Japanese naval aviator at Rabaul, recovered later, contained a single despairing line. They do not fight with honor. They fight with machinery, and their machinery is better. Back in Germany, the reaction within the upper echelons of the Luftwaffe was a toxic mixture of denial, fury, and frantic improvisation. At the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, the captured P-47D from Belgium was finally subjected to a serious, teardown analysis. The report, classified Geheim Kommandantschaft, secret command matter, landed on the desk of Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch in late November 1943. The technical findings were a masterpiece of reluctant admiration. The team, led by a brilliant but weary engineer named Dr. Heinrich Lang, had dismantled the turbo supercharger system. Lang's summary was damning. The General Electric Type C H-5 turbo supercharger is not an auxiliary device. It is the heart of the aircraft's performance, Lang wrote. It weighs approximately 200 kilograms, including ducting and intercooler. It allows the RM-2800 engine to maintain manifold pressure of 52 inches of mercury at 30,000 feet. Our DB605A engine, without such a system, loses over 60% of its power at that altitude. The system is complex, yes, but it is not fragile. The turbine blades are made of a chromium-nickel alloy we cannot match in quantity. The entire unit is mounted behind the pilot, protected by the main fuselage structure and the fuel tank. To disable it requires a direct, lucky hit. Conclusion: the P-47D is not a poor high-altitude performer. It is the finest high-altitude piston-engine fighter currently in existence. Our Bf-109G and FW-190A are outclassed above 7,000 meters. The report included stark production comparisons. Lang had obtained, through intelligence channels, estimates of American output. The Republic Factory at Evansville, Indiana, is a purpose-built facility that did not exist in 1941. It now produces over 300 P-47s per month. The Farmingdale plant produces a similar number. Total monthly P-47 production exceeds 600 units. Our total monthly production of all Bf-109 and FW-190 variants, under optimal conditions and before bombing disruptions, is approximately 750. They are producing one type of fighter at nearly the rate we produce our entire single-engine fighter fleet. Milch read the report in the silence of his heavily guarded office. He then summoned Lang. "Can we copy it? This turbo?" Lang, a practical man worn down by material shortages and political interference, shook his head. "Herr Generalfeldmarschall, the metallurgy alone would take 6 months to replicate in laboratory conditions. To tool up for mass production, 18 months at minimum, and it would require diverting nickel and chromium from tank and artillery production. Furthermore," he added, his voice dropping, "the BMW 801 radial and the FW 190 cannot be easily adapted. It would require a complete redesign. The Focke-Wulf design team estimates 2 years for a new model incorporating such a system." Milch stared at the numbers. 2 years. The Americans had gone from concept to mass-producing this system in less time than that. He knew what the report meant. It wasn't just a technical assessment. It was a death sentence for the Luftwaffe's daylight defense. He filed the report away, marking it for the eyes of the Führer only. But he also authorized an emergency directive, the accelerated development of the FW-190D, with its lengthened nose and liquid-cooled Jumo engine, and the ultra-high-altitude Ta-152. They were stopgaps born of desperation, and they would arrive too few, too late. The human cost of this technological gap was measured in the quiet spaces of airfields and barracks across the Reich. In the officers' mess at Jever, home to JG-11, veteran pilots with scores of 30, 40, even 50 victories sat over lukewarm ersatz coffee. Lieutenant Karl Müller, a 24-year-old with 48 kills, wrote in his diary on December 12, 1943, "Flew top cover for a Staffel attacking B-24s near Bremen. We never reached the bombers. The Jabs were waiting higher than us. They came down like falcons. Schultz is gone. Bauer is gone. I spent the fight diving for the deck just trying to stay alive. I did not fire a single round. This is not war. It is slaughter. We are being hunted in our own sky." The once unshakable morale of the expert was cracking. Survival, not victory, became the new metric of success. For the ordinary German soldier on the ground in France, the changing tide was felt in the relentless, unopposed presence of Allied aircraft. Jeffreiter Hans Weber, a Panzer Grenadier with the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler-Adjutant, stationed near Caen, wrote to his sister in January 1944, "We can no longer move by day. Not a truck, not a motorcycle, not a single staff car. The Jabos fighter-bombers are everywhere. They are not like the old ones. These are the Thunderbolts and they are fearless. They dive on anything that moves. We lost 3 half-tracks yesterday to them. The men say they can see the pilots' faces as they come down. There is no Luftwaffe to stop them. The sky belongs to the armies." The strategic impact was immediate and irreversible. The failure to neutralize the American escort fighters meant the USAAF's daylight bombing campaign, though costly, could continue. The combined bomber offensive was grinding German industry and oil production to dust. But the most profound consequence was yet to come. The hard-won air superiority achieved by the P-47, and soon, the even more lethal P-51 Mustang, over Western Europe in early 1944 made the previously unthinkable possible, a massive amphibious invasion of the continent. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, were underwritten by total Allied air dominance. Of the nearly 11,000 Allied aircraft available that day, the Luftwaffe could muster fewer than 300 sorties over the invasion beaches. The skies above Normandy were a solid ceiling of Allied fighters. Thunderbolts, now equipped with bombs and rockets, roamed at will, smashing troop concentrations, bridges, and armor. The German counterattacks, crucial to throwing the Allies back into the sea, were broken up before they could even form. The commander of the 21st Panzer Division, General Feuchtinger, reported in despair, "My division was cut to pieces from the air. Movement by road was suicide. We were paralyzed." As the Allied armies broke out of Normandy in August 1944, the noose tightened on the Eastern Front as well. The shifting of Luftwaffe fighter units from east to west in a desperate attempt to stem the American bomber tide had left the front vulnerable. Soviet air power, now vast and increasingly skilled, began to achieve a dominance of its own. And for Erich Hartmann, the war he knew over the Cuban finally changed. In the summer of 1944, JG-52 was shifted from the relative sanctuary of the southern sector to the hellish cauldron of the Romanian front, defending the vital Ploiesti oil fields. The skies were no longer empty. They were filled with a new generation of Soviet fighters, the Laminus 7 and the Yakmanis 3, aircraft that could finally match the Bf-109 at medium altitudes. And above them, often unseen, were the high-altitude American reconnaissance planes and the occasional, ominous presence of P-51 Mustangs on long-range penetration missions. Hartmann's tactics, the patient stalk, the single close-range burst, still worked and his score soared past 250. But the environment was different. The comforting numerical superiority was gone. Every mission was a fight for survival against swarms of enemy aircraft. On August 24, 1944, Hartmann's war intersected directly with the industrial might he had dismissed over a year before. Leading a swarm of 4 Bf-109Gs near Bucharest, he was bounced by a flight of 8 P-51 billion Mustangs of the 31st Fighter Group, roaming far ahead of the bomber streams. The Mustangs, sleek and predatory, possessed the Thunderbolt's high-altitude prowess combined with a grace the Jug lacked. Hartmann, the master, found himself in the position of France Evers. He was outclimbed, outdived, and only his unparalleled situational awareness and ruthless instinct saved him. He led his men into a thick cloud bank, escaping the kill, but one of his wingmen did not make it. Later on the ground, he examined the intelligence photos of the P-51. Its lines were clean, beautiful, even. It carried 650 caliber machine guns, and its range, the report stated, allowed it to fly from Italy to Berlin. He felt a cold not form in his stomach. The Americans had not just built a better bomber-destroyer, they had built a better everything. The final, crushing perspective on this industrial disparity came from within the Reich itself, from the eyes of its captured soldiers. Oberjefreiter Werner Schmidt, a gunner on a Flak 88 battery captured near Aachen in September 1944, was marched west to a POW holding camp. The column of prisoners was halted near the French city of Reims as a seemingly endless train rumbled past. It was not a troop train. It was a train carrying brand new, olive-drab P-47 Thunderbolts, disassembled but complete, from a French port to an advanced airfield. The cars were open. Schmidt, a mechanic in civilian life, stared in numb disbelief. "I counted," he later told his interrogators, who noted his statement as a curiosity. "I had nothing else to do. There were 47 flat cars. Each car held one fighter aircraft, crated, with its wings and propeller separate. The engines were mounted in the fuselages. 47 fighters, on one train. The guards told us it was one day's shipment from the docks, and that the trains came every day. Every day. I thought of our factory in Wiener Neustadt, how we celebrated when we completed 3 109s in a week. I sat down in the mud and did not get up for a long time." By the war's final months, the collapse was total. The Luftwaffe was a hollow force. Its veteran pilots were dead, captured, or exhausted beyond human limits. Their replacements were boys with barely 100 hours of flight time, sent up in obsolete aircraft to be cut down by aces flying machines that were generations ahead. The wonder weapons, the Me-262 jet, arrived in pitifully small numbers, a technological marvel hamstrung by fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and Allied bombing of its bases. Even when they scored kills, it didn't matter. For every jet produced, 100 Mustangs and Thunderbolts rolled off American lines. The final, devastating statistics tell the story of the collision between perception and reality. From D-Day to VE Day, the USAAF and RAF fighter commands claimed over 11,000 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat over Europe. German production in that same period was less than 8,000 single-engine fighters. They were being destroyed faster than they could be built. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that clumsy brute, would end the war with a claimed kill-to-loss ratio of 4.6, 1 against all opponents. Approximately 15,683 P-47s were built. The Luftwaffe and German anti-aircraft defenses managed to destroy 3,499 of them in combat. In return, Thunderbolt pilots were credited with destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft, 9,000 trains, 86,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. The numbers were so lopsided they seemed fictional. For Erich Hartmann, the end came not with a thunderclap, but with a weary surrender. In May 1945, with 352 confirmed kills, the highest tally in history, he led the remnants of his group in a flight to surrender to American forces, only to be handed over to the Soviets. He would spend 10 years in brutal captivity. The man who had been master of the sky spent a decade in a hole in the ground. The irony was absolute. Franz Evers, the pilot who had survived the first thunderclap, spent the rest of the war in a Canadian POW camp. In the camp library, he found a copy of Fortune magazine from 1944. It contained an article on the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford Motor Company was building B-24 Liberators. There was a photograph, an endless line of bombers nose to tail inside a single gargantuan building. The caption read, "An airplane an hour." Evers showed it to a fellow prisoner, a U-boat officer. Neither man spoke. They simply stared at the image, understanding, finally, the true nature of the force that had defeated them. It was not an army they had fought. It was the manifest will of a nation that could turn its entire economic soul into a weapon of breathtaking efficiency and scale. The laughter had died, as predicted, but in its place was not just silence, but a profound, historical lesson. The confident smirk of a 20-year-old ace over the Cuban in March 1943 was the last, untainted expression of an era of warfare that was already over. It was the smile of a man who believed war was a contest of heroes, of individual skill and valor, fought with tools crafted by artisans. He did not know that the future belonged to the engineers in Farmingdale and Inglewood, to the factory workers in Evansville and Willow Run, to the relentless, iterative pragmatism of a system that could learn, adapt, and produce not just a weapon, but an overwhelming truth. And that truth, written in the sky with contrails and the hammering of 50-caliber guns, was simple. No amount of heroism could withstand the thunderous, infinite weight of industrial democracy unleashed. The last thing to die was not the laughter, but the illusion that had spawned it. And in the cold, clear skies over a ruined Reich, only the wind remained, carrying the faint, ghostly echo of a Pratt and Whitney engine, a sound that had become the requiem for an entire military age.